The thing that's sovereign, so that's the pillar at the center that everyone gathers around, is, at least in part, the thing that courageously goes out into the unknown and makes something useful out of it for the community. There are lots of things that aren't normally distributed. Money is not normally distributed. Productivity at work is not normally distributed. The number of books people publish is not normally distributed, nor is the number of records people record, or the songs that they write, or the paintings that they make. Most people, at least in the human case, where most people have or do very little of the productive work, and a very small minority do virtually all of it. A motivational state will disinhibit or activate, depending on the situation, autonomic responses. So for example, when you are food deprived and you start to think about food and start to organize your behavior towards food as an end and to perceive the world that way, your body also prepares for food. And so the motivational state is an all-encompassing psychophysiological phenomena. It's not something as simple as chain behavior, which was an early behavioral theory, or as simple as something that's merely setting a goal. It's much more complicated than that. It's useful to think about a motivated state as a micro-personality. I mean, it's got one aim in mind fundamentally, so it's not particularly sophisticated, but it has all the other elements of a personality. Roughly speaking, emotions, or at least many of the emotions, track progress towards goals. And so they kind of tell you whether you're on the right track or not. So that's a reasonable way of distinguishing them, even though there is no single motivation system or single emotion system. We share, certainly with other people, also with other mammals, and then of course with animals that are farther down the evolutionary chain than mammals. So some of these systems are extraordinarily old. In fact, all of them are extraordinarily old. Hunger, consequence of food deprivation, obviously. Thirst, obviously. People are very dependent on water. Pain's complicated. There's physical pain, and then there's its mental equivalents. And the mental equivalents of pain are grief, disappointment, frustration, roughly speaking. The branches going up into the brain, obviously, but with all the branches, or the roots, say, going down into the body. So we discussed the central nervous system as a sort of all-encompassing system distributed throughout the body. Loneliness is another one. Then maybe it's primarily the cortical circuitry for pain that's activated, and although people who are depressed, for example, or who are grieving, often have somatic pain as well. The experiments have been done carefully enough to factor out the effect of the opiates on the vocalization, so use. And so opiates, analgesics, they basically dampen out pain and frustration and disappointment and grief and loneliness. Thermoregulation, your hypothalamus takes care of whether you're hot or cold. Panic and escape, those are circuits that also seem to be associated with pain fundamentally, although threat can maybe trigger them as well. And the panic escape system doesn't exactly seem to be the same system as the anxiety and fear system, even though they sound roughly equivalent, right? You might think of panic as just the extreme level of fear, and I think fear can trigger panic, but panic seems to be a more primordial circuit, and if you're panicking, there's an immense impetus to escape. And that's partly because their retinas are attached to their amygdala. Your retina is attached to a lot of your body, not just your visual cortex. It's attached to your spinal cord, it's attached to your nervous system at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously. And so you can use your eyes to detect things that you don't know you're seeing. So, and what in some sense, what you often detect under those circumstances is valence, value. So you're very good, for example, at detecting teeth and predatory eyes, and the reasons for that are self-evident fundamentally. Once you look at how the brain works from a pragmatic perspective, because then your consciousness is fundamentally something that's grounded in action, and you can understand the transition between consciousness and action as a sequence of analysis that are increasingly action-oriented. I'll talk to you about that a little bit later, but the basic framework is something like this, and you're always looking at the world through this framework, and the framework has as one pole where you are and what you're doing, where you are now. So that's point A. You're always trying to get from point A to point B because you're a linear creature and you're embodied, so you're moving. And so fundamentally what you're looking at the world through is a sequence of maps, and maps tell you how to get to where you want to go. And so the map specifies where you are, because obviously you can't get anywhere if you don't know where you are, and many people of course are confused about where they are, so they don't get anywhere. And you also have to know where you're going, and that's point A and point B, and every time you look at the world you're looking through a framework that has those two valued points implicit in your cognitive structure. As you're progressing through life, what you're doing continually is either interacting with things that you understand well, which means that you know how to behave in the face of, or you're interacting with things that you don't understand at all. And your body and your mind are prepared to respond to things that you don't understand at all. And they basically respond by putting you on alert. And being on alert is a sign from the deep unconscious recesses of your mind and your body, for that matter, that you don't know what you're doing in this particular space, and as a consequence you have more things to learn. And so the way you learn when you encounter something that you don't understand is by progressing voluntarily into the space and time that's unknown, and then to break it down into what you might describe as manageable doses, and then get people to expose themselves to that situation or set of situations voluntarily. And the consequence of that is that people become less afraid and more able. And the original hypothesis was that was because you were doing some form of counter conditioning, that people had learned to be afraid in a particular circumstance, and you were teaching them to not be afraid. That's wrong, that viewpoint. What you're really doing with people when you expose them to situations that they're afraid of or that they don't understand is expanding their range of competence. And you either do that by literally teaching them how to behave in those circumstances, which is what you would do with children or maybe with friends, or by helping them observe their own reactions when they're placed in a situation like that, because lots of people who are afraid of things think that when they confront something they're afraid of voluntarily, that they'll be absolutely terrified and unable to cope. But they often find that if they do place themselves in the situation carefully and voluntarily, that they're nowhere near as paralyzed by the encounter as they might have thought. And so partly what you're teaching them then is that there's more to them than they thought. It's actually quite a remarkable fact that we're all not paralyzed with anxiety all the time, but we're not. But part of what you have in your armament against the terrors of the world is the possibility that you hold within you. And people are unbelievably tough and resourceful creatures, and even if you think that you're not up to the challenge, you can be sure that encoded in your bodily structure somewhere are abilities that you don't really understand that would come to the forefront if you put yourself in a situation where they were necessary. So in some sense, you can imagine that in any given population, even you guys, there's some of you guys who were living like 50 years ago, and there's some of you living now, and there's some of you living 50 years in the future. It depends on how intelligent, imaginative versus how conservative you are. Because it's not like everyone develops at exactly the same historical rate. You get people like Nietzsche, for example, or Dostoevsky, they're like 100 years ahead of everyone else. And so, people don't even know what to do with them. But Stendhal was like that too, the writer. He wrote in the 1830s, and he was convinced that he was 100 years ahead of his time. And stylistically, that was probably about right. So, and the people who were prophets, regarded as prophets in say, Old Testament tradition, they were the same sort of people. It's like they had their ear to the ground in a sense, and they could tell what was going on underneath everybody's facade. It echoed in them often as the stories go, and I'm sure they have a mythological accuracy to them. The people who were picking up the underground currents indicating often catastrophe felt absolutely compelled, even at the risk of their own skin, to warn people.